So in this part of our Excel VBA tutorials, we're going to talk about different methods you can use to find the last row of your data. And there's really no perfect way to do this. So it really depends on how your data layout is, and you're going to have to find out the best method to go with. So I'll just talk about a few different methods in this particular video. The first method we'll talk about is the method of Ctrl+Up or Ctrl+Down. So if you're familiar with the shortcuts in Excel, if you go a particular cell and you press Ctrl+Down, it will keep going until it hits the next blank and it will stop. And then if I do Ctrl+Down again, it will keep going until it hits a cell that has a value in it. Or if there are no cells, it will just keep going all the way down. So now if I press Ctrl+Up, it's going to keep going until it finds a cell with a value. It's going to stop. Now, this type of method could be interesting if you're trying to find the last row in a column. One of the things that you should be looking out for is that if you have blank potential cells in your column, then doing Ctrl+Down from the top will not get you to the last row in your data. So for example, if I have a couple of blank cells here, if I go to the top and I press Ctrl+Down, see, it gets me to the next blank cell, but not the last cell in our data. So assuming that you have a column in your data that always has a value in it, you could go to the top and press Ctrl+Down and potentially get to the last row. So let's try to do that in code. So I'm going to go under Developer, Visual Basic. This is the file called search. I'm going to create a module here, insert and module. Quickly make a subroutine. And let's write our code. So I want to go to the cell F1, which I can do by using, for example, range object. So I could do it by simply doing F1.select. That would get me to that cell. Now from that cell, I want to do Ctrl+Down. Now I'm in my active cell. And from my active cell, I want to do AND method. And AND method gives you different options. One of them is Excel down, which is Ctrl+Down. And I want to do, again, select to basically just go to that cell. So let me just quickly click in some random cell here, go back and run this code. So you can see very quickly it went through these steps. It went to F1 and then it went to the cell that's all the way down here. Now you don't really have to write this as a two-step code. I could just write this whole thing in a single line by doing this, and it should produce the same result. So if I go someplace in here, I run this code, it should take me to the last cell in this F column. And again, this works because we don't have any blanks. So one way to potentially use the row that you found in this particular case, which would be row 17, is to store it in a variable. So what I could do, I could say LR to create a variable called LR. I could make it equal to the row that we're currently in. And the way I can get to it is currently we're in the cell, that's our active cell. And if I do that and I do dot, it gives me different methods and properties this has, one of which is row. And that will just give us the row number of that active cell, which is going to be number 17 in that particular case. So just to see that we do get the last row, I'm just going to do a quick message box. And we can do that by doing MSG box to do a message box. And then I'm going to just message that LR out. So right now, I'm just going to do this, click some random cell in here. And if I run this code, see that message box gives me 17 because we go to this last cell in this row and we get the row number, which is 17. To make this code a little nicer, we don't have to do these two separate steps. We could just do this whole thing in a single line by replacing our active cell with this entire thing, and now I can just get rid of this. So this way, we're saying, let's go to F1, do Ctrl+Down, get the row number. And if I click on some random cell and run this code, you'll see it gives me 17. And another interesting thing about this, it didn't really move me from my active cell. We just got the row number. So we kind of did that virtual action of going to F1, doing Ctrl+Down and getting the row number, but we didn't necessarily have to move our active cell. All right, so that gets us the row number. So this would be just Ctrl+Down. So I'm going to add a comment on top of this by adding an apostrophe, Ctrl+Down to find the last row. Now, some potential problems with this Ctrl+Down method is one that we already talked about. That's when we have some blank cells, instead of finding the last row, it would go until the blank cell and stop it. So if I used A1 instead of F1 in this case, it would give me row 5 instead of giving me 17. So the second problem with this method is this. If you didn't have any data in this particular cell and you went on top here and you press Ctrl+Down, it would take you to the last row in Excel, and then we would end up having this as the last row, where really we just don't have any data. So I'm going to undo this. So now let's do the second method. The second method is this. So instead of going to the top and doing Ctrl+Down, we could instead just go all the way to the bottom of the spreadsheet and then do Ctrl+Up to see where we end up. And the nice thing about this is that we don't care now if we're going to have blanks here or not. We could just keep going all the way down here and do Ctrl+Up, and we're going to end up where we're going to end up. So now let's try to recreate this in code. So that's going to be very similar to this one. I'm going to comment this line because we don't want that to happen. I'm going to create an LR variable, and this time I need to go to the bottom cell. So the bottom cell would be range A 1,048,576, which I could do, so whatever that number was. Or we could also use cells object to accomplish the same thing, where we do cells and then we give the row number. So for right now, I'm just going to give it like 10,000 is good enough. And I'm going to do 1, row 10,000, column number 1. Now, I would want to replace this 10,000 with that 1,040 something, whatever that number was, right? But I'm going to get to it in a second. So right now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do AND again. And this time, instead of Excel down, we want to do Excel up. And be careful, don't write 1 instead of L. And then we do dot row to get us the row number. I'm going to run this code. And you can see we get 17 again, because again, we did Ctrl+Up from row 10,000, column 1. Now, I want to put the last row in here. So I could do it by simply writing down this 1,048,576, right? But the problem with hard coding that number in here is that if you use this code on an older Excel version, you may have less rows than in this version. To make sure our code works in other versions as well, we're going to just get how many rows are available in this Excel. So we're going to do rows.count to just get Excel to count how many rows are in this particular workbook that we just opened. This way, we can just get this code to work the same way. So if I run this, that gives us 17. This method is fine to find the last row if you can find a column you can trust. So if you can say, I have a column in my data where the last cell is always going to have something, then you could say, if I do Ctrl+Up, I'm going to get to the last row. If I didn't have this date all the way down here, if I run this code, it's going to give me 16 because we're getting Ctrl+Up in this first column, and that's now the 16th row. but our data ends in 17. So that's one potential problem with this. The second problem that you could have with this is that sometimes you could potentially have some other things below your data that are not necessarily a part of your data. So for example, there could be a sum function that sums all of these, which I guess for dates that would not make any sense, but I could get like a max date. So now if I do Ctrl+Up, I'm gonna hit this date and it's gonna think our data ends at 20, but our data is really over here. So moving on to the next method. So this is the second way. This is actually a pretty nice way to find the last row. Again, assuming that you can find a column you can trust to just go Ctrl+Up. And you could just change this number of the column. Instead of 1, you could do 2, and you could do that Ctrl+Up in a second column to figure out the last row. Now the next way to figure out the row would be to use find method. Now to use find method, first of all, let me just explain you what it is. So you've probably used this find at some point in Excel, and we have this extra options here. Now this is basically just if we're searching for something. So if I wanted to search for Jake, I could type here and hit find next. It's gonna find Jake. When you search, there are different ways that it can search. So see, we can do a case-sensitive search or not case-sensitive search. Now let me just do Jake in a few different places so you can see how this is gonna work. I'm gonna go here and hit find next. So we found this Jake here. Now I'm gonna hit find next again, and you can see we find this Jake, and then if I hit find next, we'll find this one over here. So the reason it works this way is because when I click in this cell in A1, it starts searching from here and it goes by, right now the search type is by rows by default. So it goes like this to find Jake. There are no Jake occurrences in this row, and it's gonna keep going until the end of this row. And then we go to the second row and we keep going. There's no Jakes here too. Now the third time we go here from the left, we hit Jake, we find this first Jake. Then we keep going and there are no other Jakes in this particular row. So we go to fourth row and we find this Jake and then this next Jake. So this is the default search way, and we're searching in formulas. And formulas mean we're searching the text content of the cell, or if it was a formula here, like equals something, it would look inside of that actual formula itself, like with an equal sign and everything, it's gonna search. Now, if I change this to columns to search, now it's gonna basically change the way it's searching. Instead of searching like this, row by row, it's gonna go column by column. So if I find next, see the first Jake it finds is this one, because it went through this column A and there are no Jakes here, and then it went to B and it found this Jake. Now there are no other Jakes in this column, so the next Jake it should find is this Jake in column C. So if I do find next, see, there it is, and then we're gonna find the next occurrence of Jake in that same column, and then again in that same column. So that's how this search functionality works, and we're gonna pretty much write this in code. The question is, what are we gonna be searching? So what we're gonna be searching, we can also search by wildcards. So if I do a star as a wildcard in this search and type something like ache, if I do find next, see it's gonna search for anything that starts with anything and ends with ache. Now another interesting thing about this, if I just only use the star as a wildcard and I just do find next, it's basically just gonna go by columns and find the next cell that has something in it. So there it is. So if I do find next again, see we go the next one, next one, next one, then the next one after this is gonna skip this 2 blanks. So basically this allows us to find anything that has something in a cell. And we can search that by columns or by rows, like anything else we do. So we can go here to find next, it's gonna keep going like this. And then it's gonna keep going. See, there are no others here. All of this is blank. So the next cell with something is this cell in this row. And then it's gonna move to this 2 over to the right. So if we, for example, do find all, it's going to give us all of the cells that have something in it. Starting from the first one, and then if I scroll all the way down, it's going to be the last cell that has something in it. So I'm going to close this. Let's try to do this in code. With this find method, you can use it either on the whole worksheet, or you can use it in a particular range. So you could just say, I only want to search in this part from A1 through J23. And if you wanted to do that, you would do something like range A1 through J23. And that's the range that I want to search in. And in this range, there is a method find. So we can search. The first thing in this find is what it is that we're looking for. Find what? And I'm going to search for that star again. And because it's text in our code, it has to go in quotations, comma. The next parameter, see, it's looking and then look at and then search order. So I'm quickly just going to open the documentation for this so we can kind of look through this. And you can see that we do what, that's what we're searching for, and then find after. So what is the first cell where we want to start the search? And the next thing is looking where. So we can look in formulas, in values, in comments. So if you remember, formulas was the default method, which is probably what I'm going to use. So I'm going to just copy this Excel formulas to use for that looking parameter. I'm going to go back to my code, and here, first of all, let's just do the cell where we want to start searching. So I can use again cells object to say to start searching from the first cell on top left, which is cells 1, 1, comma, and then we're going to do this look in, which is basically where we want to search. So by default, it was formulas. And then we have look at. Let's go check what options we have here. So for look at, we can either search for partial match or a whole match. So I'll do a partial match, comma again. The next one is the search order. Let's go check what we have. See, we can go by rows or by columns, if you remember. I'm going to go by rows in this case. And then the next one is the search direction. See, the search direction, let's see what options we have here. So if I click here, see there's this Excel next and Excel previous. So next was that button that I was clicking on, find next. That's one option. So if I do that, that will be find next. And finally, we have the match case. So do we want this to be case sensitive or not? So I'm going to type false. I don't want the case sensitive match. I'm just going to skip the last two. You could also do these as well if you wanted to. So this is going to return the cell, and I want to just get what row number that's supposed to be in. So again, we'll assign it to a variable. We'll say LR is this. So right now, what's going to happen, because I'm starting my search from the first cell in the first row, first column, which is A1, it's going to go by rows, so going to go right, and it's going to find this region cell, and for that region cell, it's going to be row 1. So if I run this code, it should just output for us 1 as the last row. There it is. We found 1. So what I want to do, instead of doing what I did, instead of searching from the beginning and going this way, I want to search from the end and go backwards. And I can do that by changing this Excel next to Excel previous. And now, let me make this a little bigger. So now when we run this, see, we get 17. Now again, let's just click on some random cell here before we actually run this code. So again, we get 17. And that way we find something in the last row. And now it's not going to matter whether it's here or there. So if I just randomly just go ahead and delete some of these like this, we should be able to still find row 17. And here we go. So if you want the absolute last row, this is pretty close to getting there. But right now, we're only searching in this range from A1 through J23. I want to search in the whole spreadsheet. So the way I can do that, I can just replace it with cells. And when I do this, that basically means this entire thing, every cell in the spreadsheet. And I run this code, I still get 17, only now we're searching the entire spreadsheet instead of just using that particular range. So if you want to find the absolute last row, this is probably the best method to do it. You could face potential problems here if you have something like a formula here that gets you the max of this. And this way, now if I run this, it's going to find 20 as my last row because I have something. So that's all of this. Now this code you can write a few different ways. You could write it like this. You could also replace most of these with numbers instead. Now if I go back and look at this one, Excel formulas, where is it? Here. If I just click on this, it will tell us what number this is. See, formulas is the value -4123. So I'm going to go back and potentially replace that with that number. And then the same way I can go here, Excel part, that would be this one. And see, that would be 2. So again, 2 to replace that. If I want to go by rows search, I would go back and look here, and by rows is 1. So again, go back and replace this with 1. If I want this to be the previous one, that would be 2. So I'm going to go back here and do 2. So this would be the same line if you wanted to, I guess, have it shorter. It might be shorter, but it's also harder to understand what's going on. But if I run this, you'll see I get the same results. No difference whatsoever. So these are just replacements for these numbers. So this way it's more readable. I'm going to go back to that and leave this one as a comment. So this is great. The last thing I'm going to use here to find the last row is this way of selecting our current region. Now, if you're not familiar with that concept, let me first show you how it works. So if I click in this A1 cell, I go to Find Select and go to Special. Under Go to Special, we have this Current Region option. Okay. See, it selects this data right here. It does not select this thing that's sitting all the way down here. So this is similar to doing like Ctrl+A. If you've ever used it, it basically selects the region. Now, this is pretty fine method to select your data, unless you have some situations. So for example, if you had a blank row here and you did Ctrl+A, the blank row would separate the data and it would think this is where it ends. Similarly, if you had a blank column and press Ctrl+A, it would produce the same type of problem. Basically, the idea is if you can trust that if you press Ctrl+A, it will grab the real data set you have, then you should be fine using this method to figure out where it's going to end up being. So again, let's use this in code. I'm going to go back to this. So I'm going to find the last row. The way we're going to do it, again, I have to have a starting cell. So I'm going to say A1. So we can say range A1, or we can do cells 1, 1, which is really the same thing, dot. And then in this one, we'll have current region. And we have to type that correctly. So that should get us the current region. Now, for that region, so if we just select this range, we can just simply count how many rows we have in this range, and it's going to give us, we have 18 rows. We can do that by doing .rows.count to get the row count in that particular region. So let's run this code to see what we get. So I'm going to just randomly click some place, run this code, and we see we get 18 as the last row, which is basically this thing over here. If I remove that and we try this again, see now it's 17. That's Jake, because again, Ctrl+A in this case will select until Jake. So this is also a pretty good option to find the last row. Now you have to be careful about this though, because you're counting the number of rows in your selection. So if your data had some empty stuff on top, now if I go here and press Ctrl+A, see, it selects the entire spreadsheet. So I can't do that by doing Ctrl+A from this left upper corner. So I have to make sure first I click someplace in this data and then press Ctrl+A. So let's assume I'm going to be able to do that. So I'm going to go to this cell and press Ctrl+A. So I could go to that cell technically by doing Ctrl+Down from that cell on top to hit some cell in this first column that has some value in it, and then press Ctrl+A to actually select this range. So we can do that by, let's comment this, again, LR. So we can do that by first going to that first cell, cells 1, 1, and then to do that Ctrl+Down, see, we can do that AND method, and then do Excel down. That should do Ctrl+Down to basically bring us to the first thing in this first column, and then on that we can do current region, and that for that current region we're going to do rows.count. Now let's see what we get when we do this. So if I run this code, see, we get 17. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's not right, that should be 20. But the thing is, we're counting the number of rows in our selection. So right now, if I just do this Ctrl+Down and do Ctrl+A, my selection starts from row 4 and goes to 20. So if I start counting in this selection, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You get the idea. So we're going to get 17 rows. We're not going to add this 3 blanks on top to this. So now we need to also, in addition to that, figure out a way for us to add to this the number of blank rows we had on top of this. So let's see if we can get to that. So for example, if I do this current region and just do row, let's see what it outputs. So I'm not doing rows.count. I'm just doing Ctrl+A and I'm getting the row number. So right now, if we just run this, we get 4, the first cell with date in it. Now let me just clear that label. Let's say we potentially may not have a label there, and I'm gonna do run again. We still get a 4 because again, I'm going here Ctrl+Down, I'm hitting the 5th one, and when I do Ctrl+A, it's gonna get us the first row in our region, so that's 4. So we need to basically get 1 less to get to 3 rows. So if I do this -1, it would give me basically 3. So that's the number of blank rows we have above our data. So this just gets us number of blank rows above our data. Let's actually just comment that here. Like this. Again, we're trusting the column. So we're saying from column A1, we're doing Ctrl+Down. If your data was more like this, you would have to do this like in column 2 to make sure that happens. Otherwise, you're going to do Ctrl+Down in A column and keep going forever to the end. So I'm going to go back to this, and then I'm going to take, most of this is going to be the same. So basically, if I take the number of rows I have in my region and add to the number of blank rows, it should add up to what I need. So this is the number of blank rows. And to this, we just have to add the number of rows in the current region. So I'm going to get this to .rows.count to get to the number of rows in our current region. So with this, we should be able to run this. See, I get 20, which is what it's supposed to be. Now let me just go back and maybe add more rows on top here and run this code. So 22. So that's correct. 22. If we delete a couple of things here, that should now end up saying 18. That's correct. So this is fine, see, if you have empty cells on top of this. So what if we have something like this? It will probably still work. So let's just run this. 13. Yep, works fine. So again, this is our whole Ctrl+A method, which is current region. So I'll just do a follow-up video that will show us how to convert all of these methods to find the last column instead of finding the last row. But for this one, that should be plenty. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.